Some of the most exciting work going on right now in paleoanthropology is going on in South Africa, and in particular at the site of Malapa. The chief excavator at Malapa is Lee Berger, whose son actually discovered the site in 2008. I went to talk to Lee about what work he's been doing at Malapa, and he gave us some really exclusive access to what's going on there. Lee has been a friend of mine for a long time, and when I think of people who are working today to change the way that science is done in paleoanthropology, he's really one of the leaders. I sat down to talk with him about why he thinks Malapa is important, the work that's being done there now and how it's different from work that traditionally has been done in paleoanthropology, and some of the ways that he's trying to change the field with open access to his fossil collection. Lee is a professor at the University of the Witwatersrand, and he's an explorer in residence for the National Geographic Society. It's a great conversation where we talk about sites in South Africa, Malapa, Australopithecus sediba, the species that was discovered at Malapa, and their relationship to other early hominin sites. Lee, I want to ask you about Australopithecus sediba.
Sure.
And it is obviously, an incredible discovery. What do you think is the most exciting part about it, from your perspective?
I think a couple of things have been exciting about Sediba. More than two, in fact. One is its completeness. I think it really is the first time that we're seeing an early hominin that is very complete. Mm-hmm. Basically throughout the skeleton from head to toe, at least with the two individuals that we're concentrating our research on now, we have almost every bone represented. And in seeing that, what we're seeing in Sediba is a slightly to very different story than we had perceived from the fragmentary record. And that brings up this incredible question. Were we wrong in the way we were interpreting other Australopiths and even early Homo, or is this a different story?
Yeah.
And it also brings up a lot of critical facts that I think that our field had not realized, and that is that, for example, taking isolated anatomical areas and interpreting other areas mm-hmm. based upon the way we had looked at living apes and humans, for example, may not be as wise as we thought 5 years ago.
It throws the rest of the fossil record into a different perspective in that light.
It might.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a very real chance that we're right about that other story
mm-hmm.
and that this is just a different story,
mm-hmm.
or that, in fact, does that. It draws this enormous question. I think that's incredibly exciting. I think that alone will probably be, at least in the short term, the major advance that the skeletons of Sediba provide to the science.
Now, South Africa has been, a remarkable place in terms of fossil discoveries, and Sediba is, it is in many ways, I think, the biggest, because you have the complete skeletons. But there have been many, and these are fossils that you're obviously intimately familiar with. When you found the Sediba skeletons, knowing the context that you have, behind you, how did you think initially they would fit in?
Well, my instincts told me initially there was something different about them. And I'll tell you why, for a funny reason.
Mm-hmm.
We existed prior to 2008 with a very real paradigm in South Africa. Either you had a robust Australopith or you had Australopithecus africanus.
Mm-hmm. So
you had those two things. There were a couple of little bits and pieces that people described as possibly early Homo erectus even, but they were incredibly rare. As soon as I had the mandible prepared, and that was literally within 2-3 days of the initial discovery on the 15th of August, it didn't look like either of those two. And I'm very familiar with that record. We've got a pretty good sample. That caught me off guard, because I was walking into it with that expectation, it was one or the other. I probably carried that preconception, perhaps more so than my colleagues did, through the initial 18 months of analysis that
mm-hmm.
we went through. once we had figured out pretty clearly that it wasn't an Africanus, and that became more and more evident as we got post-Cranian, interestingly, because what was so unusual about those pieces that we were getting out was that each and every joint we found was identifiably different than this large assemblage that we'd been getting out of a place like Sterkfontein and Makapan or Swartkrans. You could, it was like the Sesame Street game. Some of these things are not like the other. You put the piece down amongst that assemblage and you would pull it back out as different.
Yeah.
That led us in early stages to, well, this must be early Homo. And certainly that was driving the early thought discussions that were going on, because we were trying to work within the paradigm that we knew. And the way our field was working at that time was very much that. If it wasn't the gracile Australopith if it wasn't a robust Australopith, then it's early Homo. And it took a long time to get through that. And really, after going to East Africa, looking at the large assemblages of early Homo, to realize that it didn't fit into anything. And that's when the decision came to say, well, what is the grade level of this thing?
Yeah.
We had by that time these long ape-like arms, but that conflicted with these very human-like hands and a human-like pelvis, and this tiny brain, but a brain that had quite a lot of complexity in the anterior part of it, and this very tiny dentition. It was this mosaic, and I've used that term before, of features, and that led us to the decision: Australopithecus, an existing genus, or Homo. We had Turkana Boy to define what really is Homo, and we have, of course, humans and Neanderthals.
Sure.
And it wasn't that.
Yeah.
And I'm still convinced of that. And that left us with Australopithecus, and that's where that genus arose from.
Do you still think it could be the ancestor of Homo?
I think that's one possibility we can't exclude. We've put together several hypotheses about what it is. It could be an extinct lineage that comes out of a gracile Australopith, and all of these various derived characters we see in the hand, the brain, the teeth, the pelvis, that are unique to humans and Neanderthals and maybe Homo erectus, are just homoplasia.
Yeah.
And this thing just goes extinct. It could be that this gives rise to the things that give rise to early Homo. I think, as everyone's very much aware, that garbage can of early Homo is a questionable thing. Some people say it's Australopithecus habilis or Australopithecus rudolfensis, or however you want to do that, and that Homo erectus is the only Homo. And it could be that Sediba gives rise to some of those things. But it's very clear, if it does, it doesn't give rise to all of them.
Right. Some
of them are too primitive. Some of them are not going to come out of this morphology. Or it could be that it's a new story, and that it gives rise directly to, for example, Homo erectus, and that those are actually just another variant of a widespread gracile Australopith.
Right. How do you think it tells us about the pattern of evolution at that time? Because I think that's sort of an interesting topic. Regardless of exactly what it's related to, you've got this pattern of data, and that must tell us something about the pattern of evolution.
Well, I think there's a couple of things that come out of that line of thinking. One is that no matter what it is, we're seeing a mosaic of evolutionary processes taking place in a very unexpected way.
Yeah.
And we can learn a lot from that. From who would have thought before Sediba that you could have such a human-like hand with its clearly elongated thumb and shortened fingers on such an ape-like arm. That alone is a paradigm shift in the mode and tempo of human evolution.
Yeah.
Who would have thought you'd get that kind of dental reduction? Where the teeth are actually within the range of Homo sapiens in size, in such an Australopith-sized cranium, where you've got the small brain. In fact, people often don't realize Sediba has perhaps the smallest brain of any Australopith. Yet there's reorganization going on. So little ideas like, encephalization became for reorganization. Well, not in this lineage.
Yeah.
The issue of the very origins of bipedalism, the idea that and why the human pelvis arose, as you're aware, that obstetric hypothesis was there.
Yeah.
The human pelvis was viewed as somehow inefficient or less efficient than the Australopithecus pelvis. Must be driven by the drive to give birth to large brain babies. Well, this isn't a large brain, and yet it's got a relatively human-like form to the pelvis. One after another, you get these mosaic features that tell us that we don't really understand the mode and tempo of evolutionary biology in the human lineage, no matter what Sediba is.
I think that's the exciting part myself, but that's the sort of thing I groove on. So
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'll tell you another part of that too. Who would have thought 7 or 8 years ago that we would be looking at a hominin that so demonstrates evolutionary processes?
yeah,
That now suddenly you can drop hominids in as being some of the best examples of evolutionary processes, no matter what this thing is.
that's right.
That you're seeing, whether that's homoplasy that's building all these shared derived features with the genus Homo, or whether it is what it appears to be. Wow, it's as good as a duckbill platypus or Archaeopteryx in a hominid fossil.
Yeah.
And it's complete.
Yeah. You have assembled an extraordinary team of scientists. Or, maybe you would say that the team is sort of self-assembled. But I think that you're really the architect behind the assembly because of the access policy that you've established for the Sediba material and because of the ease of collaboration here. How did you conceive of, sort of operating in this way?
Back in the 1990s, I began to realize after I finished my PhD that there was a lack of fairness in our field of paleoanthropology. There was almost a club, and I was lucky enough to be in that club due to my location here. I'd taken over from Philip Tobias, who held Raymond Dart's chair. I had the power of control over access. And I realized that we were raising generations and generations and generations of graduate students and then scientists who did not have access to the entirety of the fossil record unless you were a part of that club. And I saw it as inherently unfair. And that sense of unfairness built through the late 90s into the early 21st century. I wrote about open access back in long before Sediba was discovered.
Yeah.
That caused conflict, where I said, we really should open these fossils up, and people said, no, you're going to disempower the countries where these places are discovered. People are going to steal your ideas. They're going to publish before you, and that's the mechanism by which we get returns off of these, et cetera, and lots of arguments why you shouldn't do it that way. I think people often forget that, our generation of scientists are the first generation that has never been without a computer. We think about the exchange of information in a very different way. It's our generation that built companies that don't produce anything, have no real distribution of value, and are the wealthiest companies that have ever existed.
Right, yeah.
And so we do think about the exchange of data. This is perhaps the first big discovery of our generation of scientists that we had absolute authority over.
Right, yeah.
That there wasn't another generation involved in. And I didn't ever see there was another option in the way to deal with this. I didn't believe those other stories that people would steal your data, that we would not be able to garner resources and such. I just needed fossils that I had possession of to test that hypothesis. and that's what I did.
Yeah.
From word go.
Yeah.
I had a very simple rule that any bona fide scientist could see any of the material, published or unpublished, from word go. And that I'm also a believer that given an equal opportunity, the important word is there, an equal opportunity, people will do the right thing.
Right.
And that's exactly what's happened.
You have maintained an extraordinary pace of publication, for example.
31 papers in the 3 years since we announced the discovery, 15 in Science or Nature.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned the role of access as a possible threat to the countries in which, fossils are found and where they're housed. And yet, here in South Africa, obviously, the Sediba discovery has had this immense impact. And, in many ways, you're the best person to talk about this.
Well, it's done just the opposite. Open access, in fact, has empowered us. What it's done is brought hundreds of researchers and their resources from around the world. It's empowered the South African government to invest in this science. We have garnered resources in orders of magnitude larger than where they were prior to this discovery. And it does put paid, I think, fundamentally to the myth that the way in which to increase resources within the country of the discovery is to hide those fossils. The fact is that, in fact, what it does is it empowers the country and the scientists in that country to make decisions about the right way forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you're one of the most persuasive people I've ever heard on the subject of exploration and the importance of, making new discoveries and exploring. What do you tell people about that?
Well, I see a fundamental problem in our field. We created a mythology that these early hominid fossils are rare. And in doing that, we forced at least 3 and possibly 4 generations of scientists to take what they perceived as a lesser risk, and that is go into the analysis of the existing data. Almost to the point that we created an aberrancy where there are probably more scientists who study these fossils than there are fossils.
Yeah.
Or at least up until recently. That creates an area of conflict. That creates the kind of ad hominem type nature of debates within our field. What Sediba and the site of Malapa show is that the idea that we had discovered all the great fossil fields and we had discovered basically the pattern of human evolution was not true.
Yeah.
Sitting in the most explored area on the continent of Africa, so easy that a 9-year-old could find the first piece, was not only just another fragment of one of these, but maybe the richest assemblage ever discovered of early hominids. Tells us there's a lot out there to be found. We need to build a generation of explorer scientists. We need to realize that exploration is a science. We need to realize that technology empowers us to make discoveries. And we need to get people back out in the field to make these things not so rare.
Yeah. So what comes next for you?
Well, a few things. One, we're going to start excavations with the Malapa site, begin extracting in situ material. We're pushing technology in a lot of ways.
I'm going to interrupt just to say, what people may not realize is that all of the material from Malapa that so far you've been working on is material that was found essentially on the surface or after the previous disturbance at the site. And you haven't excavated yet.
That's right. We haven't excavated. Some of the materials in situ that we contact and pull out, but most of it's right there on the surface. We actually couldn't excavate until I built a laboratory over the top of it because of the potential organic material, not understanding the density of of this material. We really are working in a sort of unprecedented situation, and so. Those will be extraordinary discoveries. But Malapa's been found.
Yeah.
And the fact is that the process of extracting all of this varied information is just going to be this exciting, ever-expanding bubble that hopefully engages the entire field. From organics to dietary stuff to the rocks themselves to dating to more hominids than we probably ever hoped we could ever do.
Yeah.
I'm going to be working a lot on building an exploration school to drive that next generation of people to get back out in the field and see that is actually lower risk than trying to compete with your colleagues in the laboratory and come up with the next new idea and find more fossils, because it's clear that we don't understand this story.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to lead expeditions and show that Malapa is not a freak of nature. that those sites are out there.
Yeah.
That we hadn't seen the trees for the forest.
Yeah. So, how did you get into this field?
I wasn't supposed to be in this field, according to my parents. I grew up intuitively interested in the outdoors. I'd collected archaeological artifacts and fossils from the time I was a very young kid. But I went to university to be a lawyer because that's what my parents wanted me to be. And I hated it.
Yeah.
I didn't understand the pre-law classes. I disliked economics 101 and political science. And it was somewhere in the process of failing those courses through lack of interest that I also took electives in geology, archaeology. And I had one of these dichotomous report cards. I was failing my core area and straight A's in the other. And I went to university on a naval ROTC scholarship at a time when they gave you 2 years to choose. And I was reaching the term where I had to make a decision, and I was in very real risk of having to pay that time back and become enlisted. And I went into the young lieutenant who was in charge of supervising me, devastated, because I was literally failing out of college. And he took my report card and he said, "What do you see when you look at this?" And he slid it, and I probably cringed and went, "Failure," or something like that. And he said, "I don't see that." He said, I see someone who's not doing what they love.
Yeah.
And he pointed to those straight A's in that other course. And he said, "I'll tell you what, I'll sign your release papers if you'll go, take some time off, and come back and do what you love." That's exactly what I did. I started, like everyone, gravitating towards dinosaur paleontology because it was sort of a logical place to start. And then I read Lucy, Donald Johansson's book. And there was one line in that book that just captured me and probably speaks more to my sort of inner personality. It was the line that said there's a 1 in 10 million chance of finding one of these early hominid fossils if you're in an area you know they exist. And that made me realize that if you wanted to make a big difference in the field of paleontology, go into the field where there's such a scarce amount of information and find fossils.
Yeah.
And I ended up working my way to get into Africa, ended up at Kubifora, and then finally down to South Africa because there'd not been a single new site discovered down here since 1948. Part because the National Party came into power and collapsed it, but also the idea that it had all been discovered.
Yeah.
And I saw this opportunity to break open new ground, and I've been very fortunate.
Yeah. So if you're going to give advice to a student who was interested in getting into this area, what would you tell them?
I'd say go into exploration. I'd say get a good geological background because understanding the context of the things you're working on is fundamental. Train in anatomy, understand biology, get an understanding of fauna and flora around them, make yourself a better question asker, and then get out in the field and do. These things will not be so rare in the next generation. We just need people looking.
All right. Anything else you'd like to add?
I think we're probably in the most exciting period to be in the field of paleoanthropology. I think never before has there been more potential to have a real understanding about human origins. We're building a great fossil record now. We know there's more to be discovered. And we're also spanning it, not just a search in Africa, but the old world. And I think that the combination of technology, crowdsourcing, the way we communicate in open access is going to fundamentally transform our field.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
My pleasure.